Well, there's been some great speakers already. Hopefully, this presentation will follow from that. I think Lisa has made a really nice introduction on how beneficial use projects are prepared. This presentation is showing a lot more about a project that's recently been concluded. The presentation is part of the SARCC project, Sustainable and Resilient Coastal Cities, and we're particularly looking at nature-based solutions as part of this project. We are partner number 7, and there were 14 partners in the overall project. Please follow us on our website, www.sarcc.eu, and you can find some more resources about nature-based solutions there. This particular theme obviously is about habitat enhancement and creation, working with nature and other nature-based solutions. The project that we're looking at in this picture you might recognize from another 2Cs project. It's called USAR, Using Sediment as a Resource. And this presentation is particularly about the outcomes of the project. You can see a picture widely used also in the SEDA publications. We've been part of all the working groups there. And you can see some of the beneficial use compartments there as part of the restoration of this island called Sindri Island. So these are some of the techniques that we've been trialing and testing as part of this project. And why is this important? It's important because the climate environmental interrelationships kind of highlight that working with nature is an important aspect in order to combat climate change and adapt to this changing climate. We are exploring during these projects how ecological coastal protection can work in combating climate change and highlight the critical role of sediments and the beneficial use of sediments in this sustainable way. Without using these sediments in a beneficial way, other coastal protection solutions have to be brought up, which often involve hard engineering or structural solutions, which are not only costly, they're also not benefiting the environment and could even harm the environment, impact the environment in it. The salt marsh has a critical coastal defense function because it attenuates wave energy. And salt marsh can't really be seen in isolation because it's also always in conjunction with intertidal mudflat. So the intertidal mudflat is at the lower end of the tidal spectrum and the salt marsh on the higher end of the intertidal spectrum. It's important to realize that with sea level rise, salt marsh traps sediment and in that way grows vertically, but also grows up the tidal chain, and if there is any coastal defences higher than the tidal chain, that could stop the salt marsh migrating as such, and this is a big problem that has already been identified, and salt marsh is basically disappearing because of coastal squeeze. Nonetheless, salt marsh and mudflats are also a very important carbon sink, and it's been calculated by experts in the field that salt marsh and mudflats absorb more carbon than rainforests. So it's something that is equivalent to the mangroves of the tropical regions. So just some kind of highlights of the type of reuse that we've been looking at. This particular presentation looks at the borrow pits that were restored. The borrow pits were pits from where clay was borrowed as such. The clay was dug to create the flood embankments. And interestingly, they actually just dug up the salt marsh in the late 60s to use clay as part of the embankments. This project, nearly 50 years later, actually looks to fill these borrow pits with dredge material in order to recreate the salt marsh in front of the embankment to protect the embankment from instability and kind of bad weather scenarios. There were 23 borrow pits in total, which we connected into 7 groups in order to deal with the inflow of sediment, but also the discharge of clean water. So the borrow pits were eventually functioning as conventional lagoons by a filling process and a decanting process of clean water. And eventually we had to wait, obviously, to let the sediment settle out and then decant the clean water after a small window of time. You have to realize that these sites are all intertidal, so on a high tide, all the sites flood and obviously then fill with seawater. So the operation couldn't really happen during spring tides. It was mostly focused on neap tides, but at the same time, everything was governed by the tide, and obviously any heavy plant or anything like that couldn't stay on the marshes. So a very complex environment. But we did achieve to fill these borrow pits, and we in Brightlingsea alone we used 53,000 cubic meters of dredge material as part of the salt marshes. Sorry, 35,000 cubic meters of sediment. We had a license for 53,000. The salt marshes have been monitored, and this is some of the monitoring done by drone. So you can see the images in succession. Number one is before filling, number two is after the first filling cycle in the spring or late winter, and then during the summer it dried in number three, and number four is the first colonization. So you can see the immediate effect of the sediment and the inwards migration of the vegetation and the pioneering species. Number five, you can see later on in the season how the vegetation kind of fixated and settled. You can see the difference in types of color. So the very bright green is sand fir, whilst the kind of grayer green is a different vegetation species. We also used specialist cameras to highlight these color differences in the vegetation as part of our ecological recovery survey. We're currently writing a paper, and it should be published shortly, on how this actually was carried out, with a lot of science behind it, including soil cores, levels, benthic studies, and vegetation studies. So this is just a broad brush of the project, but there's a huge amount of data behind it. So as part of the discussion is that the serial succession has developed over 4 years to produce a well-established salt marsh, and this is evidenced by the photos, but also by the surveys that we spoke about. So the salt marsh flora will further trap sediment in the future, which will increase the habitat's elevation and providing wave attenuation and this coastal defense aspect to the local embankment. And this is an adaptation to sea level rise, and makes the embankments more robust than they were previously, and as such they're not likely to receive maintenance or the requirement of topping up of the coastal defences in relation to sea level rise. The carbon sequestration ability of these habitats is an enormous climate value that is currently being further explored. So all these salt marshes that we've been redeveloping in Brightlingsea benefit.
2 minutes left, William.
Oh, thank you. They benefit the erosive wave energy and decrease the necessity of maintenance of the grey coastal defences. Restoring nature with dredge material forms a circular economy of sustainability. So the USAR Brightlingsea pilot proved that waste sediment is suitable for habitat restoration and demonstrates the feasibility of using sediment as a resource and utilising nature and coastal management strategies. So I think it's fair to say that the USAR pilot has been successful, and hopefully can be an example for many of the other restoration projects that are being developed currently. What we found is that there are some challenges as well, and particularly the realization of large-scale projects. These, we used a fair amount of dredge material, but they're all fairly small scale. We're particularly interested in looking at larger scale projects towards using dredge material. Also, salt marsh management in systems where there is a deprivation of marine sediment can be very complex. And these so-called, I think they've been mentioned as hungry systems. There is not enough sediment in the system to actually enhance or manage the salt marsh. You'll find that there is often a lot of erosion and degradation of the salt marsh. In relation to the opportunities, I think it's clear that the beneficial use of dredge material can actually restore salt marsh in coastal areas. Also, carbon sequestration offered by salt marsh and mudflats is very important, and particularly in contrast to conventional coastal defences. Thank you. This was my presentation.